Have you ever noticed how almost every conversation about high blood pressure starts with salt, but almost never starts with the nutrient that actually helps your body deal with salt? People hear cut back on sodium so often that it has almost become background noise. It's true, of course, sodium matters. But if that is the only part of the story you've been told, then you've only been told half of the story because the body does not regulate blood pressure through sodium alone. It regulates it through balance. And one of the most important parts of that balance is potassium. Now, when most people hear potassium, they think banana. That's the whole picture in their mind. Banana equals potassium. Potassium equals banana. End of story. But that story is tiny compared to what potassium is actually doing inside the body, and tiny compared to the number of foods that deliver much more of it than a banana ever could. And that's what I want to do with you today. I want to walk you through what potassium is actually doing in your blood vessels, in your kidneys, in your sodium balance, and why a diet that is rich in potassium-containing whole foods has been so consistently linked with healthier blood pressure levels. And then once we've built that logic properly, I'm going to show you the foods that matter most, not as a random list, but as foods that make biological sense. Because once you understand why these foods matter, you stop seeing them as healthy foods in the abstract. You start seeing them as tools, specific tools, tools that interact with one of the most tightly regulated systems in the human body. And I think that changes everything. The first thing we need to do is get clear on what blood pressure actually is, because people use the term all the time without really visualizing what it means. Blood pressure is the force your blood exerts against the walls of your arteries as your heart pumps it through your body. That's the simple version. But what determines that force? Primarily two things. One is how much fluid is moving through the system. The other is how tight or relaxed the blood vessels are while that fluid moves through them. If there is more fluid volume in the system, pressure tends to rise. If blood vessel walls are more constricted, pressure tends to rise. If the vessels are more relaxed and the body is handling excess fluid efficiently, pressure tends to come down. That's the broad architecture. Now, why does potassium matter so much here? Because potassium influences both sides of that equation. It helps the body excrete more sodium through urine, and where sodium goes, water follows. That matters because sodium tends to pull water with it. If you retain too much sodium, you retain more fluid, and when fluid volume rises, pressure inside the vascular system tends to rise with it. Potassium helps counter that process. It encourages what physiologists call natriuresis, which is simply a formal way of saying the body gets rid of more sodium. But potassium does something else too, and this part is just as important. It helps blood vessel walls relax, not in a vague wellness way, in an actual physiological way. The American Heart Association explains it very simply. More potassium helps blunt the effects of sodium and helps ease tension in blood vessel walls. And when the walls of those vessels are less tense, the heart doesn't have to push against as much resistance. So now think about what that means. Potassium is affecting fluid balance and vascular tone at the same time. It is helping on both fronts. That is not a minor nutrient. That is a major player. And yet, most people are not eating enough of it. The CDC has pointed out that many people consume too much sodium and too little potassium, which is exactly the combination you would design if your goal were to push blood pressure in the wrong direction. Too much sodium, too little potassium, too many packaged foods, too few whole foods, too much engineered shelf life, too little mineral density. It is a pattern, not a coincidence. And once you see the pattern, you start seeing why the modern food environment creates this problem so easily. Processed food is almost always the same story. Sodium goes up, potassium goes down. That happens because potassium lives largely in foods that still resemble food. Beans, potatoes, leafy greens, yogurt, lentils, squash, fish, fruit, vegetables, foods with water in them, fiber in them, structure in them. But the more a food is industrially stripped, refined, shelf-stabilized, and reassembled, the more likely it is to carry sodium without carrying much potassium beside it. So when people say, I don't even use that much table salt, why is this still an issue? The answer is often because the sodium isn't arriving from the salt shaker. It's arriving from bread, sauces, restaurant meals, deli meats, soups, snack foods, frozen foods, condiments, and all the normal little defaults that don't feel dramatic enough to matter individually but matter enormously in the aggregate. And that brings us to something I think is genuinely important to understand. Blood pressure is not usually being pushed around by one villain. It is being shaped by a whole environment of inputs. And potassium-rich foods matter because they don't just add potassium. They usually displace something else. They shift the whole pattern. A bowl of lentils is not just potassium. It is potassium instead of a sodium-heavy, ultra-processed side dish. A baked potato with its skin is not just potassium. It is potassium plus fiber plus satiety plus a lower sodium anchor for a meal. Plain yogurt is not just potassium. It is potassium plus protein plus a more stable breakfast than the pastry people keep pretending is food. That substitution effect matters. Now, before I tell you which foods are worth paying the most attention to, I want to slow down and be very clear about one important caution, because this is where responsible health education matters. Potassium is helpful for many people, but more potassium is not automatically better for every person in every situation. If someone has chronic kidney disease or a condition that affects how the body handles potassium, or they take certain medications, especially medications like ACE inhibitors, ARBs, or potassium-sparing diuretics, then this conversation changes because the kidneys are the primary system for removing excess potassium. And if that system is impaired, potassium can build up in the blood. And when potassium gets too high, that can become dangerous. So this video is general educational information. It is about the biology of potassium-rich foods and blood pressure in the broad public health sense. It is not a one-size-fits-all instruction for every medical situation. And I want to say that clearly because good health information should always be honest about where context matters. Now, with that said, let's get into the part most people are actually waiting for. Which foods matter most? And I want to start with a food that people routinely underestimate because it has somehow developed a very strange reputation in modern nutrition culture. Potatoes. Not fries, not potato chips. Potatoes. A plain potato is one of the most potassium-rich, commonly eaten foods in the entire everyday diet. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute has listed a small potato at around 738 milligrams of potassium. That is far more than what most people mentally associate with a banana, and it matters because potatoes have been culturally misfiled as junk food, when in reality the food itself is not the problem. The processing is the problem. The deep frying is the problem. The sodium load is the problem. The whole potato is not the problem. This distinction matters because nutrition conversations keep collapsing foods into their worst commercial form. Potatoes are not fries the way oats are not frosted oat cookies. A food has to be separated from what industry did to it. And a potato, especially when it is baked or boiled and not drowned in sodium, is delivering potassium in serious amounts. Sweet potatoes are also strong here, and the American Heart Association highlights them as well. So if you're looking for a food that gives you real potassium density, this is not a side note. This is one of the lead actors. The second category is beans and lentils. And I love this category because it solves more than one problem at once. The NIH lists lentils at well over 700 milligrams of potassium per cooked cup in some references, and beans like kidney beans, lima beans, and soybeans also contribute substantial amounts. But what makes this category especially interesting is that beans and lentils do not arrive alone. They arrive with fiber. They arrive with plant protein. They arrive with slow digestion. They arrive with satiety. They arrive with a very different metabolic effect than the refined, starch-heavy foods that dominate so many people's diets. So if someone wants to improve blood pressure support through food, legumes are not just helpful because of their potassium. They're helpful because they are part of an entirely different dietary pattern, a pattern that tends to be more stable, more mineral-rich, and less sodium-driven overall. And there's another thing I think people miss here. When you replace a processed meal with a bean-based meal, you are often lowering sodium exposure and raising potassium exposure in the same move. That's exactly the kind of shift that matters physiologically. Third, plain yogurt and other low-sugar dairy foods. This one surprises people because dairy is not always the first thing that comes to mind in a potassium conversation, but it absolutely belongs in the discussion. NHLBI lists plain non-fat or low-fat yogurt around the 530 to 570 milligram range per 8-ounce serving, which is substantial. And yogurt also fits something that came up repeatedly in the DASH research. The combination of fruits, vegetables, and low-fat dairy appears to have a meaningful blood pressure lowering pattern. Now, I want to be careful here. The reason yogurt matters is not because yogurt is magical. It matters because it is part of a food matrix. It provides potassium, yes, but also protein, calcium, and in fermented forms, potentially beneficial bacterial cultures as well. A plain yogurt with no added sugar is a very different biological object from a dessert pretending to be yogurt. And again, this is the pattern I want you to notice. Potassium-rich foods that support healthier blood pressure are very often foods that come with structure. They come with other useful nutrients. They come with less chaos. Fourth, leafy greens. Spinach, beet greens, Swiss chard, and similar vegetables show up again and again on potassium lists, and for good reason. These foods are dense, not just in the calories to nutrient sense, but in the mineral sense. They carry potassium in a package that also contains folate, magnesium, fiber, and a range of plant compounds that make them disproportionately valuable relative to the number of calories they bring with them. But I also want to say something practical about leafy greens because people often nod along to the idea and then do nothing with it. The problem with leafy greens is not that people don't know they're healthy. The problem is that they often treat them like garnish, a decorative afterthought, a symbolic gesture. That is not how these foods work best. A few stray leaves under a sandwich is not the same thing as an actual serving of cooked greens, or a generous salad, or a bowl that makes the greens meaningful. Cooked spinach, in particular, concentrates quite a bit because the volume shrinks so dramatically. So if you want these foods to matter physiologically, they have to appear in amounts that are real, not ceremonial. Fifth, tomatoes and tomato products. Tomatoes are interesting because they often show up in people's diets without being recognized as a meaningful potassium source. Tomato sauce, tomato juice, and cooked tomato products can contribute substantial amounts. NHLBI lists tomato sauce among notable sources, and this is useful because tomato products are versatile. They can become part of meals people already eat, soups, stews, bean dishes, grain bowls, egg dishes, fish dishes. But here's the catch. The same product that gives you potassium can also bring a sodium problem if it is heavily salted. So this is where labels start to matter. A low-sodium tomato product gives you a very different equation than the same product loaded with salt. This is why I keep returning to balance. It is not enough to say potassium-rich as if that ends the conversation. You have to ask what else is riding along with it. Sixth, squash and other starchy vegetables. Acorn squash shows up on both NIH and AHA lists. Winter squash more broadly shows up in Harvard's guidance. These foods are easy to overlook because they don't have the branding power of bananas or avocados, but they deserve attention. They are mineral-rich, naturally low in sodium, and they fit beautifully into the kind of food pattern that DASH research supports. And I think there is a larger lesson hiding here. The foods that help blood pressure the most are usually not superfoods in the social media sense. They are ordinary foods that humans have been eating for a very long time: beans, potatoes, yogurt, greens, squash, fish, fruit. Nothing about this is exotic. It is just aligned with physiology. Seventh, fish. Fish is not usually the first category people think of for potassium, but several commonly eaten fish contribute meaningful amounts. The NHLBI- materials note that fish like cod, halibut, rockfish, trout, and tuna can provide useful potassium, and fish also changes the structure of the meal. It often displaces processed meats that bring much heavier sodium loads. So again, you are not only adding something good, you are often replacing something worse. This double effect matters more than people realize. Eighth, fruit, but with a correction. Yes, bananas belong on the list. Of course they do. The American Heart Association places a medium banana around the mid 400 milligram range, and bananas are convenient, accessible, and familiar. But bananas are not the king of potassium. They are the ambassador of potassium. They are simply the food that won the marketing war in the public imagination. Dried apricots, prunes, raisins, cantaloupe, oranges, and other fruits can also contribute meaningful amounts. But here is the correction I want to make carefully. Fruit is helpful, but fruit juice is not always the same conversation. This matters because once food becomes juice, you can lose fiber, compress sugars, and make the food easier to consume quickly. The sample script you gave me treated this idea very seriously in the stomach context, and the same principle matters here. The whole food matrix changes how a food behaves. So while some juices contain potassium, whole fruit usually gives you a more stable and useful package. That does not mean juice is poison. It means food is usually more effective when it still looks like food. Now, at this point, someone might reasonably ask a question that sounds simple but is actually the center of the whole discussion. If potassium-rich foods are so helpful, why isn't everyone with high blood pressure just told to eat more potassium and call it a day? Because potassium is not a trick, it's not a hack, it's not a secret nutrient that overrides everything else. It works as part of a pattern, and this is where the DASH trial becomes so important. Back in the original DASH study, researchers tested dietary patterns rather than magical ingredients. One pattern was closer to a standard American diet. Another emphasized fruits and vegetables. A third, the combination pattern, emphasized fruits, vegetables, and low-fat dairy while reducing saturated fat. The results were remarkable. The combination diet significantly lowered blood pressure, and in people who already had hypertension, the effect was even larger. That's important because it tells you something very specific. Potassium matters, yes, but potassium inside a broader dietary pattern matters even more. Why? Because blood pressure is affected by many variables simultaneously. Sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, body weight, fiber intake, vascular function, insulin sensitivity, food processing, total diet structure. The body is reading the whole signal, not one nutrient in isolation. So when you eat a meal built from whole potassium-rich foods, you are usually changing a whole signal. And that's one of the reasons I get a little frustrated with supplement culture, because supplement culture loves to take a large physiological story and reduce it to a capsule. It wants to believe that the answer is the molecule separated from the meal. But nutrition often does not work that way. The body responds to patterns, combinations, rates of absorption, displacement effects, and overall context. That is why trusted organizations keep emphasizing potassium from food first, not because supplements are always bad, but because foods come with architecture. Now, I want to spend a moment on something people often misunderstand about sodium and potassium, because I think this misunderstanding quietly sabotages a lot of people. People think the goal is to find a few potassium-rich foods and add them on top of an unchanged diet. So they keep the fast food, keep the packaged snacks, keep the restaurant sodium, keep the ultra-processed breakfast, keep the takeout sauces, and then add a banana and feel like they have addressed blood pressure biology. They have not. Because potassium is not meant to decorate a sodium-heavy diet. It is meant to be part of a different kind of diet. Harvard has pointed out that sodium and potassium have opposite effects in the body, and that the typical modern diet often runs in exactly the wrong direction. Too much processed food sodium, too little whole food potassium. That ratio matters. That balance matters. The body is reading both sides. So the real question is not, what potassium-rich food can I sprinkle into my life while everything else stays the same? The real question is, what kind of eating pattern makes potassium naturally rise while sodium naturally falls? That question gets you much closer to the truth. And the answer, again and again, is some version of this. More vegetables, more beans, more fruit, more plain dairy if you tolerate it, more fish, more minimally processed starchy vegetables, fewer heavily salted packaged foods, and a much stronger preference for meals that were assembled from ingredients rather than manufactured from formulations. That's the pattern. Now let me make this very concrete, because abstraction is useful only up to a point. What might a potassium-supportive day actually look like? Breakfast could be plain yogurt with fruit and a handful of nuts, or eggs with cooked spinach and a side of fruit, or oatmeal with seeds and a potassium-rich fruit on the side. Lunch could be lentil soup, or a bean bowl with vegetables, or a baked potato topped with Greek yogurt and chives and served with a salad. Dinner could be salmon with roasted sweet potato and greens, or a tomato-based bean stew, or a bowl built around squash, legumes, and vegetables. Notice what I am not doing there. I'm not constructing a weird medicalized diet. I'm describing normal food. That is one of the most reassuring things about this entire topic. When you look at the research carefully, the answer is not bizarre. It is not expensive powders. It is not a patented beverage. It is not "doctor hates this one fruit" nonsense. It is food, real food. Food that keeps showing up across continents, across dietary traditions, across decades of research, and across public health guidance from multiple institutions. And that consistency is worth noticing. When NIH, WHO, the American Heart Association, the CDC, and decades of dietary research keep circling back to the same terrain, potassium-rich foods from whole food patterns, that is not trend logic, that is evidence slowly converging. There is another point I want to make here that I think is quietly powerful. Many potassium-rich foods are also foods that improve meal satisfaction. This matters because sustainable dietary change rarely happens through deprivation alone. People do not keep eating in a healthier way because it made them feel punished. They keep eating in a healthier way because the meals were satisfying enough to repeat. A baked potato is satisfying. Beans are satisfying. Yogurt is satisfying. Fish and vegetables with a starchy side are satisfying. Fruit with texture is satisfying. And that matters more than nutrition conversations often admit, because the most elegant blood pressure theory in the world is useless if the actual meals do not work in real life. Now, I also want to correct another very common simplification, which is the idea that blood pressure improvement must feel dramatic in order to matter. It doesn't. The body is not waiting for a cinematic transformation. Small shifts in blood pressure at the population level matter enormously. A few millimeters of mercury is not emotionally exciting, but physiologically and statistically it is meaningful. And dietary patterns do not usually work by shocking the body, they work by nudging it, repeatedly, in a better direction. That's why the food pattern matters so much. It is not the one meal, it is the repetition. The repetition is the mechanism. Every breakfast that is less processed and more mineral rich. Every lunch that replaces sodium-heavy convenience food with beans, vegetables, yogurt, fish, or potatoes in their intact forms. Every dinner that is built from ingredients instead of industrial flavor engineering. That repetition is what the body experiences. That repetition is what the kidneys experience. That repetition is what your sodium-potassium balance experiences. And over time, the body starts reading a different environment. Now let me tell you the foods from this whole discussion that I think deserve to stay most clearly in your mind. If you remember nothing else, remember these categories: potatoes and sweet potatoes, beans and lentils, plain yogurt and low-sugar dairy foods, leafy greens like spinach, tomatoes and lower-sodium tomato products, winter squash, fish, fruit including bananas, but not only bananas,